Hi, it's Mrs. Gray again. Now I'm going to talk about chapter 17 in this video. I'm just sitting here during office hours. Again, this format looks different because I updated Windows and Screencast-O-Matic doesn't work anymore. So hopefully I get that fixed soon. Again, I'm just still grumbling about the lesson that I learned. I don't know why I update things. I always hit ignore, and I should. All right, anyways, chapter 17. Now this is the first part of the trial. And just so you know how it works, Mr. Gilmer is the prosecutor, and he gets to call his witnesses first. And then Atticus will call whatever witnesses he has. So we're going to see Mr. Gilmer's witnesses, and the two witnesses that we see in this chapter are first Sheriff Tate, Heck Tate, and second Bob Ewell. All right, and because they are Mr. Gilmer's witnesses, he gets to interrogate them first. He gets to ask them questions first, and then Atticus will get a chance to ask them questions. And then if Mr. Gilmer chooses, he can go up and he can ask them, redirect. He can ask them more questions if he wants to. So that's kind of how it works. At first, we see Heck Tate, and so this is Mr. Gilmer. Again, this guy right here, Mr. Gilmer. That's Tom Robinson. He's not in this chapter yet. So Mr. Gilmer is going to call his first witness, which is Heck Tate. And you guys will see me in this chapter, if you saw the last one with the characters, me just grumbling. So I chose Heck Tate. Again, he wouldn't be wearing that Stetson, that cowboy hat in the actual courthouse. That would be rude. But I just like you guys to remember that Sheriff Tate, Heck Tate, is the cop, basically. He's the sheriff. Okay, so Mr. Gilmer asks some questions, and then Atticus asks some questions. Now, one thing that I want to point out about Heck Tate's testimony, the first thing that Atticus wants to harp on is whether or not a doctor was called. Was a doctor called when the crime of rape was reported? That's typically, a rape victim would go to a doctor if if she made that report. However, Heck Tate says, yeah, there's no doctor called. I didn't see a reason to call a doctor, which Atticus, obviously he does not like that answer. Why wouldn't you call a doctor? Mayella should have gone to a doctor. Another thing that Heck Tate confirms in this chapter is he confirms that Mayella definitely was beaten up by somebody. She had bruises around her neck. She did not do this to herself. She had bruises on her face. So it was very clear to Heck Tate that Mayella was attacked, and we can believe him when he says that. He says that he shows up, he sees that Mayella had just been attacked. It's very obvious from her bruises and her injuries. And he asked who it was, and they told her it was Tom Robinson. They told him that it was Tom Robinson. So that is a big thing. And then on page 225, remember I'm reading, hopefully you have the same version of the book that I'm reading. So on page 225 of the book, Heck Tate seems to be confused a little bit, which is, and then Atticus even does a little bit of a double take, and he's like, what are you talking about? Wait, hold on, let's try to make sure we get this figured out. So there is some confusion, and I want to talk about that confusion because it is very important, okay? Atticus is actually asking about Mayella's injuries, and it's funny how Heck Tate talks like she was all bunged up. She was, she obviously had been beaten. She was all banged up. And anyways, Atticus goes, okay, so which side of the face? And on page 225, Mr. Tate, it says right kind of at the top, Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, her left. So if you can imagine Mr. Tate, he's trying to figure out left versus right. And obviously when you're looking at somebody, your left is their right. So he's like, okay, she was beaten up on her left. And Atticus goes, wait a minute, Sheriff, said Atticus. Was it her left facing you or her left looking at the same way you were? Mr. Tate said, oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face. So Heck Tate was confused. He said Mayella was beaten up on her left side of the face, but really he meant his left. And so he thought about it, and he's like, okay, no, actually, if it's my left, then it's her right, because she's facing him. So the big thing that we learned from Hectate's testimony is that she was beaten up on her right side of the face. And that's important, and we'll continue to talk about that. So Mr. Tate is just a little bit confused, and I think he's genuinely confused. I don't think he's trying to lie about how Mayella was, where she was beaten up. I think he just, kind of a little simple-minded moment there. So Atticus harps on it, and he says it again. Okay, wait, her right eye, yeah. And he almost, and the thing you should know is that Sheriff Tate kind of seems excited. Oh yeah, it was definitely her right eye. It seems like everybody knows the secret that we don't know yet. So anyways, so they, Atticus finishes his interrogation of Mr. Tate, of Sheriff Tate, and they call Mr. Ewell to the stand. And remember, this is Mr. Ewell, Mayella's father, and he is not a nice name. Now, nice person. Now, his name is Bob Ewell. That's what they call him, but his full name on 227, they call him as Robert E. Lee Ewell. So Bob obviously is short for Robert. And there's a great description of him, of Bob Ewell from the book. And I'm just going to read that really quickly. In answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin, pointed, and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It seemed to be part of his crepey neck. I love that she describes him as kind of like a strutting rooster. And if you've seen, roosters kind of strut about, I think of it like a scrawny rooster, to kind of compare to, someone that's kind of mangy almost. He's newly washed. He is clean because he has gone to trial. But so that's the description of Bob Ewell. I think it's a great description. And she describes on page 228, she describes the Ewell property, which I think is important. The varmints, and I'm sorry, I know I'm reading a lot of this book to you, but this is an important chapter. These trial chapters are important to understand. So on page 228 at the top, first full paragraph, she's describing how the varmints, the rats or animals that eat garbage, feasted on the Maycomb's refuse at the dump. So the varmints had a lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough gleaning every day, and the fruits of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs, broomsticks, and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammerheads. Snaggletooth raked heads, shovels, axes, and grubbing hoes held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, and an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars under which scrawny orange chickens pecked hopefully. This is the Ewell yard, so his house. From the outside, what they see. I love that description. The Ewell yard looked like the playground of an insane child. And if you want a kind of a visual of the insane child, think of, if you've seen Toy Story, I can't remember his name, the kid who takes the toys and tears them apart, the bully kid. Kids always, when I'm talking about this in class, someone always remembers his name, but I'm talking to myself right now, so I can't remember it. But anyways, that little bully kid in Toy Story, and they have to rescue Buzz Lightyear from, I think. It's been a while since I've seen that movie. So anyways, another part of this page that I want to read, just to kind of give you some insight into Mayella. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence in a line were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums. These are geraniums. I stole a picture offline. Cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson, had Miss Maudie disdained to permit a geranium on her premises. People said they were Mayella Ewells. So imagine you live in the dump. Your dad's house is surrounded by garbage that's not well tended, and yet still in the one corner of the yard, you still try to plant flowers, some geraniums, and you try to make it look pretty. That confuses the people of Maycomb, but it looks like Mayella is trying to make the best of her situation. In my other video about the characters, I said that I feel bad for Mayella. Her situation is awful. She comes from a horrible household, and yet in the middle of that, she seems to have a little bit of hope. And to me, that hope is symbolized by the red geraniums. She wants a better life for herself. All right. So when we're listening to Bob Ewell talk, Mr. Gilmer starts asking him questions, and Mr. Gilmer says on page 230, he says to Bob Ewell, "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" was the next question. And this is how Bob Ewell responds. "Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead," was the answer. That's a very rude response. That's implying that if he's not the biological father, then the mom cheated on him, and he can't do anything about it because she's dead. That would have really kind of mortified a lot of people in this society in this time period. Judge Taylor did not like that, and you see him. Look at the description of Judge Taylor on page 230, right below what I just read. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in his swivel chair and looked benignly at the witness. "Are you the father of Mayella Ewell?" he asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. "Yes, sir," Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. "This is the first time you've ever been in court. I don't recall ever seeing you here." At the witness's affirmative nod, he continued, "Well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand?" Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, "All right, Mr. Gilmer." So Judge Taylor used a lot of big fancy words to say, "Hey, you knock it off right now." And he says, "Do you understand?" And it's very clear. You may not have understood what Judge Taylor said, but he's basically saying, stop it with the obscene speculations, with the obscene talk. And Bob Ewell nods. He gets the picture, like, I need to stop with this nonsense. So anyways, he says almost immediately after that, when Mr. Gilmer asks Bob Ewell what he sees when he goes into the cabin, because Mr. Ewell supposedly witnessed Tom Robinson raping Mayella Ewell, and he puts it in a very derogatory way, and that just throws the courtroom into a roar. And remember, we've got children watching this court scene, and Scout and Jem and Dill are not supposed to be there, but they've sneaked up and they're watching from the balcony, which is where the black people are to sit, because remember, it was segregated. And Reverend Sykes, when he hears Mr. Gilmer, when he hears Bob Ewell say this really obscene language, he's like, "Gosh, maybe you shouldn't be here." And we see that on page 231, and he's like, "Yeah, maybe Miss Jean Louise, which is Scout, should be here." And Jem's like, he doesn't want to leave, and he doesn't want to take his sister home. So he's like, "Scout, go home." And she's like, "You have to make me." And Jem tries to say to Sykes, Reverend Sykes, "I don't think she understands what's going on." And that offends Scout. She, just so you know, she doesn't understand what what Bob Ewell is saying, but she's like, "Yeah, I understand." So anyways, that's just a funny part. Like, if I were an adult and kids were watching that under my watch, I would tell them to go home, or I would take them home myself. It's not Reverend Sykes' responsibility to send the kids home. It's not his kid, but he does make an effort, and they convince him to let them stay. Then Atticus, because Mr. Gilmer is his witness. Bob Ewell is Mr. Gilmer's witness. He gets to interrogate Bob Ewell, but then Atticus gets a chance, and he makes Atticus is asking him questions. Mr. Gilmer's still asking him questions on 234. And one thing that Bob Ewell says that is just kind of ridiculous. Black people, there's a community of African Americans past the town dump, and so they would walk through or past Bob Ewell's house to get to their own houses, their own homes. And Bob Ewell says that they're devaluing his property. The fact that they go past his property devalues it. Keep in mind that he lives in the town dump. and it's covered in trash. I imagine now, obviously, we don't really have a description of the African American homes. They're probably very poor because at this time, African Americans were not given opportunities. But I very much doubt that they were as devaluing Bob Ewell's property. If anything, his property was devaluing theirs. So anyways, now it's Atticus' turn to ask a question, but one thing you should know is that Bob Ewell gets up. Once Mr. Gilmer asks him all his questions, he gets up. He thinks he's done, and he actually runs into Atticus and on his way off the stand, and Atticus is like, oh, sorry, and he says it very politely. He's like, just a minute, sir. Could I ask you a question or two? And that makes Bob Ewell look stupid, and he kind of is stupid. I mean, obviously the other lawyer gets to ask you questions. So Bob Ewell's a little, momentarily embarrassed, but he gets back on stand. And one thing that Atticus, I'm trying to, talk more quickly and summarize. One thing that Atticus says is that he asks Mr. Ewell, or Bob Ewell, sorry, if, what side of the face Mayella was beaten on. And Bob doesn't really know. I don't think he knows. But he says, I hold with whatever the sheriff said. And so Hecate said that she was beaten on her right side of the face. And then Atticus goes on to say, Mr. Ewell, and this is on page 236, Mr. Ewell, can you read and write? And that seems really off topic. Like, this is not about Bob Ewell's literacy. And it's almost, that question's almost not allowed. And Mr. Gilmer, he objects and he says, can't see what the witness's literacy has to do with the case, irrelevant and immaterial. But actually, Judge Taylor says, make sure we see why this is relevant. And so Bob Ewell, he says, I most positively can. And can you write your name and show us? Asks Atticus. I most positively will. How do you think I signed my relief checks? Mr. Ewell was endearing himself to his fellow citizens. The whispers and chuckles below must probably had to do with what a card he was. So now he's kind of hamming it up a little. So when Bob Ewell goes to write his name, everybody's looking and watching him write his name, which is really weird. And so Mr. Ewell wrote on the back of the envelope and looked up complacently to see Judge Taylor staring at him as if he were some fragrant gardenia in full bloom on the witness stand, to see Mr. Gilmer himself half standing at his table. The jury was watching him. One man was leaning forward with his hands over the railing. Everyone's really scrutinizing to watch Mr. Ewell, Bob Ewell, write. And he doesn't really understand why it's so important. What's so interesting? He asked. You're left-handed, Mr. Ewell, said Judge Taylor. Now, why is that important? We're talking about right versus left, and that was really important to Atticus, and Bob Ewell is left-handed. And Scout, even in this chapter, she's beaten up enough kids, she's gotten enough fights that she can figure this out. And I think you can see me on this. So she's holding up her left hand, and she's picturing somebody in front of her, and she's, holding, and I always, we kind of mime this out in class. And so she's holding up her left hand and she's pretending to punch somebody in front of her. Well, if you're punching somebody with your left hand, that person is going to receive the punch probably on the right side of their face. It's kind of hard to take your left hand and punch somebody on their left, right? Because that's not how it works, right versus left. And so it seems that Atticus has made the point that if Mayella had a black eye on the right side of her face and Bob Ewell is left-handed, it would make sense that Bob Ewell could have been the one who punched Mayella and who had actually beaten her up. The faulty part of that reasoning is that, well, Tom Robinson could also be left-handed for all we know. But as far as Jem is concerned, he's like, oh, we got him now. Bob Ewell is left-handed. Mayella was beaten up on the right side of her face. Obviously, Bob did it. And Scout's not so sure. One last funny part of this chapter, Mr. Gilmer, he gets up, he gets to redirect and ask his witnesses a question, and he says, Bob Ewell, about your writing with your left hand, are you ambidextrous, Mr. Ewell? ambidextrous means that you can write with both your left and your right hand equally. And Bobule, he responds, I most positively am not. I can use one hand good as the other. One hand good as the other, he added, glaring at the defense table. That's funny to me because ambidextrous means exactly what Bobule said, that you can write with one hand as well as the other hand. And but he doesn't know what ambidextrous means. So when Gilmer says, are you ambidextrous? He's like, I am not. He thinks it's an insult. So anyways, I will stop talking. It's probably like a 12-minute video again. But that's chapter 17. And just bear with me while I figure out how to stop recording. Bye.